By the year 500 CE, the Arabian Peninsula was an unforgiving expanse of rock and sand. At its heart sat Mecca, a bustling settlement trapped in an era known as Jahiliyyah, the age of ignorance. Society here was ruthlessly divided. The strong oppressed the weak, relying on enslaved labor while squandering wealth on gambling and alcohol. Women were treated as property, and in a practice driven by misplaced tribal pride, newborn daughters were often buried alive to avoid perceived dishonor. At the center of this society stood the Kaaba. Centuries earlier, the Prophet Ibrahim built it for the worship of one God. But as we see in this vintage view of the Great Mosque, that original purpose was lost. The tribes had filled the sanctuary with 360 distinct idols, claiming one for nearly every day of the year. This setup created a unique geopolitical anomaly. Arabia sat right between two massive warring superpowers, the Christian Roman Empire to the west and the fire-worshipping Persian Empire to the east. Yet the brutal terrain kept foreign conquerors away. Protected from outside rule, these independent tribes preserved a culture centered on ancestral pride and a rich oral tradition of poetry. The harsh isolation that allowed their moral decay to fester also created a secure perimeter. No foreign king could easily march in and suppress a local uprising. Into this severe environment, Muhammad was born. Historical accounts describe his arrival sending physical ripples across the region, triggering anomalies that reached the borders of the very empires that ignored Arabia. According to tradition, a sacred fire in a Persian temple that had burned continuously for 1,000 years suddenly went out. At the same time, a tremor shook the Persian Empire, cracking the great arch of the Khosra Palace, the remains of which still stand today. Meanwhile, back in Mecca, idols surrounding the Kaaba inexplicably toppled. His early years stripped away all tribal comfort. Orphaned by the age of 6, he was sent to live with a Bedouin nurse named Halima. Growing up in camps like the one seen here, he mastered the purest form of the Arabic language and adapted to the extreme physical demands of the desert. Returning to Mecca as a young man, he stood apart from the vice around him. His honesty as a merchant earned him the rare title Al-Amin, the trustworthy. This reputation for integrity caught the attention of Khadija, a highly successful businesswoman who proposed marriage to him. These early years stripped away the traditional armor of a Meccan leader. Without a father's protection or a family fortune, he navigated the tribal landscape armed only with his character. This isolation prepared him to stand alone against the very society that had once respected him. At 40 years old, that character was put to the test. While seeking isolation in a mountain cave, he received the first verses of Revelation. This event shifted him from a respected merchant into a prophet, tasked with calling his people back to the worship of a single God. His message aggressively challenged the Meccan status quo. He demanded the destruction of their idols and preached absolute human equality. Under this new faith, wealthy tribal leaders held the exact same worth as the poor and the enslaved. The Quraysh leadership saw a clear economic dead end. As this data illustrates, Mecca's 360 idols generated constant pilgrimage traffic and trade revenue. Monotheism would dismantle that machinery, bankrupting the elite families who controlled the city's tourism and commerce. To protect their wealth, the Quraysh retaliated with violence. They targeted the most vulnerable converts first, torturing enslaved Muslims like Bilal and Ammar on the burning desert sand. The brutality reached a point where the Prophet ordered a group of early believers to flee across the sea and seek asylum in Abyssinia. The Quraysh were protecting a generational monopoly. They understood that a society built on tribal privilege and enslaved labor could not survive if every person was granted the same spiritual standing. When physical violence failed to stop the message, the Quraysh escalated to economic warfare. They hung a pact inside the Kaaba, banning all trade, all marriage pacts, and interaction with his entire clan. For 3 years, families were forced into a barren valley, surviving on leaves and dried animal skins while their children starved. The boycott finally broke in an unexpected way. The Prophet informed his uncle that the physical decree hanging inside the Kaaba had been eaten away by termites. When the Quraysh checked, they found the document destroyed, with only the name of Allah remaining intact. This relief vanished almost as soon as it arrived. Within months of the boycott ending, the Prophet suffered two devastating losses. His wife, Khadija, who had spent her entire fortune supporting the early Muslims, passed away. Weeks later, his uncle, Abu Talib, his primary physical protector, also died. Stripped of his closest allies and facing constant harassment, he traveled on foot to the wealthy neighboring city of Taif to seek refuge. Instead of listening, the leaders mocked him and ordered the city's youth to chase him out, pelting him with stones until his shoes filled with blood. Bleeding and resting in an orchard outside the city, surrounded by these harsh mountains, he experienced his ultimate test. An angel appeared, offering to crush Taif between the rocky peaks. The Prophet refused. He told the angel he hoped that one day their descendants might still accept the truth. In his most painful moment, he held absolute power over his abusers and chose mercy. This restraint proved his mission was driven by a desire for spiritual change, not a quest for human conquest. Following this period of sorrow, he received a validation known as the Isra, the night journey. In a single night, he was transported from Mecca to Jerusalem, arriving here at the site of the Al-Aqsa Mosque. His arrival carried deep historical weight. Inside the sanctuary, he found all the previous prophets waiting for him, figures like Ibrahim, Musa, and Isa. He stepped forward and led this gathering in prayer, physically uniting the entire Abrahamic lineage. From Jerusalem began the Miraj, the ascension. He traveled upward through the seven heavens, greeted by past prophets at each level, until he reached the absolute cosmic boundary, a point where even the angel Jibril could not pass. At this boundary, he received a vital requirement for his followers, the command for daily prayer. Originally set at 50 prayers a day, he negotiated the number down on the advice of Musa, eventually settling on 5 daily prayers that retained the spiritual reward of the original 50. After being beaten by his neighbors and starved by his own tribe, he was shown the vastness of the universe and granted an audience with the divine. It cemented an authority that no earthly governor or tribal leader could ever touch. When he returned to Mecca the next morning and recounted the night journey, the Quraysh erupted in laughter. To them, traveling to Jerusalem and back in a single night was an impossible claim meant to be ridiculed. But he silenced the crowd by doing the unexpected. When challenged, he accurately described the specific doors and walls of Al-Aqsa, a place he had never previously visited. He then correctly predicted the exact arrival time and condition of Quraysh merchant caravans currently returning from the north. Realizing the elite of Mecca were completely deaf to his words, he changed his approach. During the annual Hajj season, he bypassed the Quraysh entirely and began intercepting pilgrims from outside tribes, sharing the message with travelers before they returned home. This tactic worked. People from other cities began accepting Islam. Terrified that the Prophet was building an outside alliance, the Quraysh leaders gathered to execute a final plan, a coordinated assassination involving a warrior from every single tribe, ensuring no one could be held responsible for the blood money. They believed extreme pressure would crush the movement. But the brutal conditions of Mecca only served to forge an unbreakable core of believers. By forcing the Prophet to look beyond the city walls, the Quraysh unknowingly guaranteed that the message would escape the desert and reach the rest of the world.